The chandeliers sparkled like falling stars, but no light could hide the cruelty unfolding in the grand ballroom that night. Laughter rippled through the air as Andrew Weston, a man once praised as the rising star of Wall Street, strutted across the marble floor. On his arm clung Hila, a 23-year-old influencer in a blazing red dress, her smirk sharp enough to cut glass. Guests whispered, cameras flashed, and Andrew basked in the spectacle, as though humiliating his ex-wife in public was his greatest achievement. "Look at her," Andrew boasted to a group of investors, tilting his glass of champagne. "She thought she'd survive without me. Pregnant, broke, forgotten. She'll beg to come back. Mark my words." The crowd laughed politely, though a few shifted uncomfortably. But Andrew only grew louder, drunk on arrogance. Hila tightened her grip on his arm, her eyes glittering with triumph. Across the ballroom, Emma Weston stood in the shadows. Her hands trembled against the silk fabric of a dress that didn't quite fit her swollen belly. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry. Not here, not tonight. But Andrew's voice echoed, each word like a dagger twisting deeper. The man she had once loved, the father of her unborn child, was parading his betrayal as if it were a trophy. Guests stole glances at Emma, some with pity, others with thinly veiled amusement. Their whispers burned hotter than the chandeliers. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, but her pride forced her to stand still. Her heart hammered painfully, her baby kicked inside her, and she wondered how humiliation could hurt worse than labor pains. Then, in the middle of her despair, her phone vibrated inside her clutch. She almost ignored it, but curiosity won. The message glowed on the screen. "Miss Weston, your jet is ready. Please proceed to the private terminal. Everything you need is waiting." Her breath caught. A jet? For her? Who could possibly? And just as Andrew raised his glass to toast his mistress, Emma lifted her head. Something inside her shifted. Tonight, humiliation would no longer define her. Something bigger, something shocking, was about to begin. Emma Weston had never been the kind of woman to command a room. She wasn't loud or flashy. Her beauty was the quiet kind. Soft brown eyes that carried warmth, a smile that once made strangers feel safe, and a heart so generous it often left her vulnerable. She was only 28, but life had carved invisible scars across her spirit. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood in Pennsylvania, Emma grew up believing in simple dreams. A home filled with laughter, a husband who cherished her, and children who would never know the loneliness she had felt as a child of divorced parents. Her mother worked double shifts at a diner, and her father had long since disappeared into another life, another family. From a young age, Emma promised herself she would create a family different from the broken one she knew. That promise seemed to come true when she met Andrew Weston. He was charming, ambitious, and carried himself like the world already belonged to him. For Emma, who worked as a receptionist at a local law office, Andrew seemed larger than life. He wooed her with expensive dinners, roses delivered to her work desk, and promises of a future where she would never struggle again. Against her mother's cautious advice, she fell in love with him quickly and completely. Within a year, they were married. At first, their life together seemed like the fairy tale she had always dreamed of. Andrew's career in finance took off, and Emma played the role of the supportive wife, organizing dinners, attending galas, and always smiling for the cameras when photographers captured their picture-perfect marriage. She never complained about his late nights at the office or his obsession with climbing higher. She believed his drive was for both of them, for the family they planned to build. But as time passed, Emma began to see the cracks. Andrew became distant, critical, and increasingly cruel. He mocked her for not having a real career, brushing aside her dreams of finishing college. When she discovered she was pregnant, she thought the news would bring them closer. Instead, Andrew barely reacted. His only concern was how a baby would affect his social image. Behind closed doors, Emma endured a different Andrew. The one who slammed doors, spent recklessly on himself, and left her counting pennies for groceries. She stayed silent, convincing herself that every marriage had struggles, that patience would bring back the man she had fallen for. But the patience nearly broke her spirit. When Andrew finally abandoned her, parading Hila like a prize, Emma was left with nothing but a small apartment, mounting medical bills, and a belly that carried the only piece of joy she had left. Nights were long, filled with tears she hid from even her closest friends. Some mornings she didn't know if she had the strength to get out of bed. Yet each time the baby kicked, she reminded herself she wasn't living just for herself anymore. Emma's strength was quiet but unyielding. Though the world saw her as fragile, there was a fire inside her that hadn't yet burned out. She just didn't know how to let it blaze. And that was the night it all began to change. The night her phone buzzed in the middle of the gala, she stared at the mysterious message about a private jet, her heart racing, torn between disbelief and desperate hope. Who could possibly send such an offer? Who even knew where she was? As Andrew laughed with his mistress under the chandeliers, Emma's trembling fingers typed a single word in reply. Who? What came back would change her life forever. The world Emma had once been a part of was not built for the weak. It was a place of glass towers that reached for the heavens, ballrooms dripping in crystal chandeliers and champagne poured like water. Every event, every handshake, every smile carried weight. The city's elite thrived in this atmosphere, an endless game of wealth, power, and appearances. Andrew Weston had clawed his way into this glittering circle, determined to prove himself among the titans of finance. To him, life was a performance, and the grand stage was the annual galas, the exclusive charity dinners, the rooftop parties where billion-dollar deals were whispered between glasses of Dom Perignon. Emma had once walked beside him through this world, clinging to his arm, her modest dresses standing out in a sea of couture gowns. Back then, she had been naive enough to believe she belonged. Now, everything about this backdrop felt cruel. The gala where Andrew flaunted Ela was held at the prestigious Sterling Hall, a mansion-turned-ballroom where walls of marble reflected the glitter of candlelight. Each corner of the room boasted flower arrangements imported from Holland, while the orchestra played soft Mozart that masked the sharper notes of gossip. The guests wore jewels worth more than Emma's entire life savings, and every conversation seemed designed to flaunt power. For Emma, the opulence was suffocating. She had come hoping to quietly slip in, drop off a small donation in Andrew's name, and leave without being noticed. But fate had other plans. The crowd buzzed, not because of the charity they were supposedly supporting, but because Andrew had arrived with Ela. They paraded through the hall as though they owned it, enjoying the whispers, thriving on the envy. It was more than a betrayal, it was a calculated spectacle meant to crush Emma's dignity once and for all. But even beyond the gala, the backdrop of Emma's life was shifting. The small apartment she now called home was a stark contrast to the penthouse she once shared with Andrew. Gone were the silk sheets and panoramic skyline views. Instead, she fell asleep on a second-hand couch, a stack of unpaid bills sitting on the kitchen counter. The city outside didn't care. Its streets glowed with neon and ambition, reminding her that she was invisible in a place that worshipped money. Yet within this same city also lived people like Ethan Blackwell, the mysterious billionaire whispered about in boardrooms but rarely seen in public. Rumors painted him as reclusive, ruthless in business, but oddly generous in private. Some said he invested millions in anonymous charities, others claimed he had walked away from Wall Street altogether to build his empire in silence. No one knew the full truth, and that made him dangerous and untouchable. And it was in this backdrop of dazzling wealth and suffocating cruelty that Emma's fate would take a shocking turn. The very world that had mocked her, crushed her, and tried to erase her would soon become the stage for her greatest transformation. Every glittering chandelier, every marble hall, every camera flash would bear witness. As the night deepened, Emma's phone buzzed again. Another message. Her breath hitched as she read the words, "Look to your left. I'm already here." Her heart pounded. She turned her head slowly, fear and curiosity colliding inside her chest. And that was when she saw him, the man the city whispered about, the billionaire who could turn empires upside down with a single word, watching her from across the ballroom. Andrew Weston had always been a man hungry for validation. Even as a boy from a modest suburb, he carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed the world owed him more. That hunger for power, for recognition, for applause, he never fed it with kindness or hard work alone. He fed it with arrogance, manipulation, and the ability to charm people long enough to take what he wanted. In the beginning, Emma had mistaken his confidence for strength. She thought his determination to succeed would give them both a better life. But tonight, in the golden light of Sterling Hall, she saw the man Andrew truly was. A predator, basking in his own cruelty. His tuxedo was tailored to perfection, his hair slicked back in a way that screamed vanity, and his smirk, oh that smirk, was the weapon he used to slice her dignity in half. "Gentlemen," Andrew said, raising his glass toward a circle of investors, "success isn't just about money, it's about moving on from dead weight." His eyes flickered toward Emma across the room, lingering just long enough to draw every gaze with him. Laughter followed, cruel and sharp, and Emma felt her cheeks burn. And clinging to Andrew's arm was Ela. 23, with the kind of beauty that demanded attention. Long legs, perfectly sculpted cheekbones, and lips painted the color of sin. She wasn't subtle, She didn't have to be. She leaned into Andrew, her manicured fingers grazing his chest as though staking her claim in front of everyone. Every move was calculated, from the way she arched her back to show off the plunging neckline of her dress, to the triumphant glance she tossed in Emma's direction. Yila had been working her way into this world for years. Once a struggling model, she had learned quickly that ambition dressed in silk could open doors. Andrew was her prize, her ticket to fame, and she wasn't ashamed of it. Together they formed a toxic spectacle. Andrew with his desperate hunger for validation, Yila with her ruthless desire for influence. The whispers swirled like wildfire. That's his ex-wife over there, isn't it? Poor thing. She looks exhausted. And that girl? Half his age, but twice as cunning. The cruelty of the crowd fueled Andrew's ego. He wrapped his arm tighter around Yila, tilting his chin toward Emma as if daring her to break. For Emma, it was unbearable. Every humiliation she had endured in private was now being broadcast under chandeliers and champagne. And yet, as much as she wanted to crumble, something inside her refused to shatter completely. Watching Andrew and Yila bask in their arrogance, she felt not only pain, but also the faintest flicker of resolve. Because deep down, she knew the higher Andrew climbed on this fragile pedestal of pride, the harder his fall would be. And when it came, Yila would not cushion his landing. She would step aside, leaving him to break alone. Emma's heart pounded as she tried to steady her breathing. She clutched her phone, the mysterious message still glowing on the screen. But before she could type another word, a ripple of movement caught her eye. Across the ballroom, Andrew was making his way toward her, Yila still clinging to his arm, both of them smiling like wolves. And in that moment, Emma realized they weren't done humiliating her. They were about to confront her face to face, in front of everyone. The laughter around the ballroom hushed as Andrew Weston strode toward Emma, his mistress Yila draped on his arm like a diamond necklace. Heads turned, whispers followed, and even the orchestra seemed to soften, as though the entire hall leaned in to watch. Emma froze, her breath shallow, her hands tightening around her clutch. She wanted to disappear, but there was no escape. Andrew was bringing the storm straight to her. Well, Andrew drawled, his voice smooth with mockery. If it isn't my ex-wife, Emma, you look different. His eyes traveled pointedly to her swollen belly, then flicked back to his audience, inviting their judgment. I suppose congratulations are in order, though I can't imagine who would. He paused, letting his words drip with poison. Choose to inherit my leftovers. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Emma's face burned hot. She opened her mouth to reply, but before she could, Yila leaned in with a cruel smile. Andrew, darling, don't be unkind. She's doing her best. Not everyone has the luxury of staying glamorous during unfortunate circumstances. Her gaze dropped deliberately to Emma's dress, one that barely concealed her pregnancy. The insult was a dagger wrapped in sugar. Andrew chuckled, raising his champagne glass as though offering a toast. To Emma Weston, he announced loudly enough for the room to hear. Proof that not every fairy tale has a happy ending. The laughter that followed was shallow but sharp, echoing in Emma's ears like breaking glass. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. She had endured months of whispered gossip, of neighbors avoiding her eyes, of financial strain so tight she sometimes skipped meals to save for the baby. But this spectacle of cruelty was worse than any private betrayal. Andrew hadn't just abandoned her. He wanted to erase her dignity entirely. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, clearly embarrassed for Emma, but no one spoke up. In their world, silence was safer than choosing sides. Emma stood rooted, trembling, her heart screaming to fight back, but her voice caught in her throat. Andrew smirked, satisfied with the damage he had inflicted. Yila leaned her head on his shoulder, her laughter like nails on glass. Together they turned to walk away, confident they had destroyed what was left of her spirit. But just as Emma lowered her eyes, her phone buzzed again. Another message lit up the screen, sharp and urgent. Stand tall, don't give them your tears, I'm here. Emma's pulse quickened. She glanced around, desperate to find the sender. And then, across the ballroom, she caught sight of him again, the mysterious billionaire whose gaze never wavered from hers. Ethan Blackwell. His presence was a lifeline in the storm, steady, unshaken, almost daring her to reclaim her pride. Emma swallowed hard, forcing herself to straighten. For the first time that night, she didn't look away from Andrew. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was defiance. And as Andrew's smug grin faltered ever so slightly, Emma realized this battle wasn't over. Because the game Andrew thought he controlled was about to spin out of his hands, and Emma was no longer standing alone. The gala ended, but Emma felt as though she was still standing in that ballroom, trapped beneath the weight of every laugh, every cruel whisper. Hours later, she sat alone in her tiny apartment, the flickering streetlights outside casting shadows across the peeling walls. The silence was unbearable. It pressed against her chest until she thought she might suffocate. Emma curled up on the worn couch, still in her dress from the night before, her hair tangled, her makeup streaked with dried tears. Her swollen belly rose beneath the fabric, a constant reminder that she wasn't just carrying her own pain, she was carrying an innocent life. She laid a trembling hand against it, whispering, "I'm so sorry, baby. I don't know how to protect you from all of this." Her phone buzzed with dozens of notifications. Photos from the gala were already plastered across social media. Headlines screamed, "Andrew Weston flaunts new love, ex-wife watches from the sidelines." Another read, "Weston's former wife looks worn, struggling as he celebrates new chapter." Emma's chest tightened, her breathing ragged. She threw the phone aside, unable to look at another cruel headline. Her tears came fast, hot, uncontrollable. She sobbed until her throat ached, until her body shook so violently she feared she might harm the child within her. The shame was unbearable. It wasn't just Andrew who had humiliated her. It was the entire world watching her crumble. Her mind spiraled into dark places. She wondered if Andrew was right. Maybe she was nothing more than dead weight. Maybe she didn't deserve happiness or love or even dignity. The walls of the apartment seemed to close in, the air heavy with despair. For a terrifying moment, she imagined what life would be like if she simply disappeared. No more pain, no more humiliation, just silence. But then, as if sensing her despair, the baby kicked. A firm, undeniable push from within. Emma gasped, her sobs catching in her throat. She pressed her hand harder against her belly, tears still flowing, but softer now. "You're right," she whispered shakily. "I can't give up. Not on you." Her strength, however, was fleeting. The exhaustion of carrying her sorrow dragged her down again. She fell into restless sleep, her body still trembling. When morning came, the world outside moved on as though nothing had happened. But Emma woke with swollen eyes, her heart raw, her spirit cracked in half. She shuffled into the bathroom, stared at her reflection in the mirror, and barely recognized the woman staring back. Hollow eyes, pale skin, lips pressed into a thin line of despair. She touched the glass as though reaching for someone she had lost. The knock at her door startled her, sharp, deliberate, echoing through the silence of the apartment. Emma's heart raced. She wasn't expecting anyone. Fear twisted in her stomach. Was it Andrew? A journalist? Another cruel reminder of her downfall? She hesitated, every instinct screaming to stay silent. But the knock came again, firmer this time. Gathering what little courage she had, Emma opened the door a crack. And standing there, tall and composed, was the last man she ever expected to see outside her apartment. Ethan Blackwell. For a long moment, Emma could only stare at him. Ethan Blackwell. His name carried weight like thunder in the city. He was the kind of man people whispered about in boardrooms and gossip columns, though few ever saw him up close. His empire stretched across industries, tech, real estate, finance. Yet he remained an enigma, rarely attending events, almost never seen in public. And now, impossibly, he was standing at her door. "May I come in?" His voice was low, steady, with a calmness that cut through her fear. Emma hesitated, embarrassed by the state of her apartment, by her swollen eyes and trembling hands. But something in his gaze, steady, almost protective, made her step aside. Inside, Ethan glanced around briefly, taking in the modest furnishings, the unpaid bills stacked on the counter, the worn couch. He said nothing, but Emma caught the flicker of something in his eyes. Anger, not at her, but at the situation she'd been forced into. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Did Andrew send you to finish humiliating me?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't work for Andrew Weston. I don't respect men like him." His words carried a finality that left no room for doubt. Emma's defenses crumbled, and tears welled again. "Then why? Why would someone like you show up at my door?" Ethan studied her for a long moment before answering. "Because I know what he did to you, and because you don't deserve to face this alone." Emma's breath caught. She opened her mouth, but no words came. "I was at the gala," Ethan continued. "I saw everything, and I've seen enough of Andrew Weston to know his arrogance is built on lies. Men like him think women like you are disposable, but they're wrong." He leaned closer, his tone softening. "You're stronger than you realize, Emma, and I intend to help you prove it." Her heart raced. She wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at her. "Why would you care? You don't even know me." Ethan's eyes darkened with something unspoken. "You're not a stranger to me, not entirely." Emma frowned. "What do you mean?" For the first time, Ethan looked uncertain, as though weighing how much truth to reveal. Finally, he said, "Years ago, before Andrew, you volunteered at a children's hospital in Philadelphia. You read stories to the kids. One of those kids was my nephew. You sat by his bed every week. You probably don't remember, but he never forgot. Neither did I. Emma blinked, stunned. Memories rushed back, small hands clutching her own, a boy with bright eyes fighting an illness too big for his tiny body. She remembered the sadness of those visits, the way she tried to bring light into the darkness. She hadn't realized anyone was watching. I owe you, Ethan said quietly. And more than that, I can't stand by while Andrew destroys you. The room seemed to spin. All this time, when she thought she was invisible, someone had seen her. Someone powerful. Someone who cared. Emma, Ethan said firmly, you have more power than you think, and Andrew is about to learn that the hard way. Emma's breath trembled, her mind reeling. She didn't know what Ethan meant, or what kind of help he was offering, but for the first time in months, she felt the faint spark of hope flicker in her chest. And when Ethan reached into his coat pocket and placed a sealed envelope on the table, Emma realized this was no simple offer of kindness. This was the beginning of a plan that could change everything. The envelope sat on the table like a loaded gun. Emma stared at it, her fingers trembling, afraid to touch it. She glanced at Ethan, who remained calm, his expression unreadable. What is this? She whispered. Opportunity, Ethan replied. Everything Andrew thinks you don't have. Finally, she tore it open. Inside were documents, ownership transfers, investment agreements, a trust fund already in her name. Emma's eyes widened as she read, her pulse quickening. This can't be real. It's real, Ethan said. I've been watching Andrew play with fire for too long. He thinks humiliating you makes him powerful, but the truth is his empire is fragile. With the right moves, it can collapse overnight. I'm offering you a chance not just to survive, but to rise. Emma's breath shook. For months she had felt powerless, drowning in debt, crushed by shame, and now, in her hands, was proof that she wasn't finished. For the first time, her future didn't look like a slow fade into obscurity, but doubt gnawed at her. Why me? I'm not strong like you. I'm not. Ethan interrupted sharply. Stop, you are strong, stronger than Andrew ever wanted you to believe. He tried to break you because he feared what you could become. Tears welled in her eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not even her own husband. She pressed a hand to her belly, whispering, I don't want my child to grow up seeing me broken. Then don't, Ethan said firmly. Stand tall. Rebuild. Let this be your turning point. The days that followed marked the beginning of Emma's transformation. Ethan arranged everything quietly, shielding her from the spotlight while giving her the tools to regain control. She enrolled in business classes, determined to sharpen her mind. He connected her with stylists who dressed her not in borrowed gowns, but in clothes that reflected her new strength. And though Emma had never cared for vanity, seeing herself in the mirror, poised, confident, radiant, ignited something fierce inside her. But the most powerful change wasn't in her appearance. It was in her spirit. Where once she trembled at Andrew's name, now she spoke it with steady resolve. Where once she avoided crowds, now she walked through lobbies and cafes with her head held high. Slowly, the shame that had smothered her began to peel away, replaced by a quiet fire. One evening, Ethan found her in the study of his penthouse, surrounded by papers and textbooks. Her hair was tied back, her belly round, but her eyes blazed with determination. You're working too hard, he said lightly. Emma looked up, smiling faintly. I have to. I need to be ready. I won't let Andrew define me anymore. Ethan studied her for a moment, pride flickering in his gaze. Good, because soon the world will see who you really are. Emma's heart skipped. She leaned back, exhaustion mixing with anticipation. For the first time since her world collapsed, she believed she had a future worth fighting for. But even as hope bloomed, a question lingered in her mind. How far would Ethan take this war against Andrew? And was she truly ready for the storm that was coming? The answer came sooner than she expected, when an invitation arrived, gilded and cruel, summoning her back into Andrew's world. The envelope that arrived days later was deceptively beautiful. Heavy cream cardstock, edges gilded in gold, sealed with the emblem of Weston Capital. Emma turned it over in her hands, dread curling in her stomach. She didn't need to open it to know what it was. Andrew's next performance. Inside, the invitation confirmed her fears. The Weston Capital Annual Charity Gala. The same stage where Andrew had once paraded her as his wife. Now he would use it again to flaunt Ila, his shining new prize. Emma's instinct was to tear the card in half, to hide away in her apartment and pretend the world outside didn't exist. But Ethan, sitting across from her, took the invitation from her trembling fingers and studied it calmly. You're going, he said. Emma blinked. I can't. Not after last time. Not after. He leaned forward, his voice steady but sharp. Emma, this is your chance. Andrew thinks you're broken, forgotten. He's expecting you to hide, but imagine his face when you walk in. Strong, radiant, untouchable. You won't just survive the room. You'll own it. His words struck something inside her. The memory of Andrew's smirk, the sound of Hila's mocking laugh, the sting of whispered pity from strangers, it all burned in her chest. She had hidden long enough. So the transformation became her armor. Ethan's team worked tirelessly, preparing her for the night. A stylist draped her in a gown of midnight silk, tailored to embrace her pregnant figure with dignity and power. A jeweler placed diamonds at her throat, each stone catching the light like a star. A makeup artist painted confidence across her face, not to hide her pain, but to reveal the strength she had forged through it. When Emma looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Gone was the woman who trembled under Andrew's cruelty. In her place stood someone new, resilient, luminous, a force he could no longer dismiss. "You look," Ethan murmured, watching her from the doorway, "like the storm that's about to break." Still, Emma's heart pounded with nerves. What if I fail? What if he humiliates me again? Ethan stepped closer, his voice low. "He can only humiliate you if you let him. Remember, Andrew thrives on control. Tonight, you take it back." The night of the gala arrived. Sterling Hall gleamed brighter than before, chandeliers casting a golden glow over gowns and tuxedos worth fortunes. Limousines lined the street, paparazzi flashes painting the night sky white. Inside, Andrew held court with Hila, his laughter echoing across the marble floors. He was untouchable, or so he thought. Outside, a black car pulled up to the entrance. The driver opened the door and Emma stepped out. Gasps rippled instantly through the crowd of photographers. Cameras flashed furiously. Voices shouted her name. She stood tall, every inch of her radiating strength, her gown flowing like liquid night. Her hand rested proudly on her belly, not as a weakness, but as a declaration. Reporters scrambled, shouting questions. "Emma, are you back with Andrew? Who designed your gown? Is it true you're seeing someone new?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her presence was the answer. From inside, Andrew caught sight of the commotion. His smirk faltered. Hila clutched his arm tighter, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. And as Emma entered the hall, every head turning toward her, Andrew realized, for the first time, that he was no longer in control. The gala was in full swing when Emma entered, but in a heartbeat, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations faltered, champagne glasses froze midair, and every camera swung toward her. The orchestra's music played on, but it was drowned beneath the thunder of whispers that spread like wildfire across the hall. Emma moved with steady grace, her gown flowing behind her like a shadow made of light. Each step was deliberate, a silent declaration that she was no longer the broken woman Andrew had mocked. Her hand rested gently on her belly, not as a shield, but as a crown. From across the room, Andrew stiffened. His glass of champagne hovered near his lips, his smirk curdling into disbelief. Hila leaned closer, her whisper sharp. "She's just trying to make a scene. Don't let her win." But Andrew's composure was cracking, the mask slipping from his carefully curated arrogance. Unable to resist the spotlight, Andrew stepped forward, dragging Hila with him. His voice carried through the hall, louder than necessary, laced with forced amusement. "Emma," he drawled. "What an unexpected surprise. You clean up nicely for someone living off scraps." The cruelty hung in the air, but this time, Emma didn't flinch. She met his gaze head-on, her voice calm but resonant. "And you still mistake cruelty for power, Andrew. Some things never change." A murmur ran through the crowd. This was not the meek Emma they remembered from months ago. This was someone new. Someone unafraid. Hila, unwilling to be overshadowed, chimed in with a mocking laugh. "Honestly, Emma, don't you think it's time to stop embarrassing yourself? You had your chance with Andrew. Now you're nothing but a cautionary tale." She looped her arm tighter around Andrew's, flaunting her place by his side. Emma's lips curved into the faintest smile. "A cautionary tale? Perhaps, but not mine. Tell me, Hila, does it feel empowering to be a placeholder? To know that when the novelty wears off, he'll discard you just as easily as he discarded me?" The words sliced cleanly, and for the first time, Hila's smile faltered. The crowd reacted instantly. Gasps, raised brows, hushed laughter at the sting of Emma's remark. Andrew's face reddened, fury simmering beneath his skin. He leaned closer, his voice low but audible to those nearest. "You think you can waltz in here, humiliate me, and walk away? You're still nothing, Emma. Nothing without me." Emma straightened her shoulders, her voice carrying like a bell. "You're wrong, Andrew. I was nothing with you. Without you, I am free, and soon the world will see you for what you really are." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the orchestra faltered, the violinist missing a note before the conductor signaled to stop altogether. All eyes locked on Andrew, who stood exposed, cornered in a way he had never been before. Andrew's jaw clenched, his smile forced as he glanced around at the watching faces. Investors, rivals, the very people whose approval he craved. The cracks in his empire were beginning to show. And then, as if on cue, a new figure appeared at Emma's side. Ethan Blackwell, tall and composed, his presence commanding immediate attention. He placed a hand lightly at the small of Emma's back, his gaze fixed on Andrew with quiet authority. The room erupted. Shutters clicked, whispers turned into shouts, and Andrew Weston realized his worst nightmare had just walked in with his ex-wife. The moment Ethan Blackwell stepped beside Emma, the gala transformed into a stage no one had anticipated. Flashbulbs exploded, the sound of cameras relentless as if history itself was being captured. Whispers rippled like fire. Is that Ethan Blackwell? With Emma Weston? What does this mean for Andrew? Andrew's face drained of color. For years, Ethan had been a shadow looming over the financial world. Untouchable, ruthless, and more powerful than Andrew could ever dream of being. And now, here he was, standing in solidarity with Emma, his hand resting protectively at her back. Careful, Andrew, Ethan said quietly, but the words carried to those closest. The higher you climb, the further you have to fall. Andrew forced a laugh, loud and bitter, trying to reclaim the room. Fall? Don't be ridiculous. I built Weston Capital from nothing. Unlike some men, I don't need family money or smoke and mirrors to stand tall. He raised his glass toward Ethan. But it's touching that you've come all this way. To play knight in shining armor for a woman who doesn't know her place. Emma felt her pulse spike, but Ethan's expression never changed. Calm. Controlled. Dangerous. Then, from the corner of the hall, a man in a crisp suit stepped forward. He wasn't a guest anyone recognized, but he moved with purpose. He handed an envelope to a well-known financial journalist in attendance. Within seconds, the journalist's eyes widened, scanning the documents inside. He turned pale, then glanced sharply toward Andrew. The whispers began again, louder this time. Guests pulled out their phones, murmurs escalating as messages spread like wildfire through the crowd. Emma frowned, confused, until she caught the words passing between them. Embezzlement. Missing funds, illegal transfers. Andrew noticed too. His smile faltered. What's going on? He demanded, his voice rising with panic. The journalist cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the hall. Mr. Weston, would you care to comment on allegations that millions from Weston Capital's charitable foundation were redirected into offshore accounts under your name? The hall erupted. Gasps, shouts, flashes of cameras. Investors exchanged horrified glances. Even Yila's grip on Andrew's arm loosened. That's absurd, Andrew barked, his face red. Fabricated nonsense, a pathetic attempt to tarnish me. Who put you up to this, Blackwell? He pointed a shaking finger at Ethan. But Ethan only tilted his head slightly. The truth doesn't need me to dress it up, Andrew. It speaks for itself. Emma stood silent, her heart racing. She hadn't expected this. Whatever Ethan had planned, it was unfolding faster and sharper than she imagined. And Andrew, once untouchable, looked cornered. Guests began backing away from him, murmuring, distancing themselves as though his very presence might stain their reputations. The orchestra had long since stopped. The only music now the frantic tapping of reporters sending updates to the world outside. Andrew turned in desperation to Yila. Tell them it's not true, tell them. But Isla's eyes darted nervously. For the first time, her perfect smile cracked. She stepped slightly away, her silence louder than any denial. Andrew's voice shook with fury. This is a setup. I'll sue every last one of you. Weston Capital is stronger than ever. Yet even as he shouted, more documents appeared in the hands of reporters. Emails, bank statements, evidence too damning to ignore. The truth had slipped its leash, and Andrew could no longer control it. Emma felt the weight of poetic justice settling around her. For months, she had been the one humiliated, mocked, discarded. But now, in front of the same glittering crowd, Andrew Weston was unraveling. And when one reporter shouted the final piercing question, Mr. Weston, are you aware your mistress's name appears on several of these accounts? The entire hall turned to Yila, and silence fell like a guillotine. The silence that followed the journalist's question was suffocating. Every eye in the ballroom shifted toward Yila, who stood frozen, her flawless complexion paling under the chandelier's glow. For months, she had thrived in Andrew's shadow, basking in his arrogance, feeding off his power. But now, the spotlight burned hotter than she could withstand. Yila? Andrew's voice cracked, desperate. Tell them it's a mistake. Tell them you know nothing about this. But Yila's eyes darted from the reporters to the investors, to the cameras that captured every flicker of fear on her face. The predator's confidence she had worn so well began to crumble. She stepped back, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her body trembling under the weight of the crowd's suspicion. I didn't know anything. she stammered, her voice breaking. Andrew, you never told me where the money came from. I thought. You thought? Andrew roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. Don't you dare turn this on me. You were there. You signed the papers. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones snapped more photos. Journalists scribbled faster. The story had shifted in real time. Not just a scandal of embezzlement, but of betrayal. Yila shook her head violently, her eyes filling with tears. No. I was just following your instructions. You told me it was routine. Marketing funds, travel expenses. I never questioned it. She looked around, pleading with the crowd. I was manipulated. I'm a victim in all of this. The audience erupted into a storm of whispers. Emma, standing nearby, felt a strange calm settle over her. She had once envied Yila, hated her even, for the way she flaunted Andrew's attention. But now, watching her crumble, Emma realized Yila was no queen. She was a pawn, and Andrew had used her just like he had used everyone else. Andrew's fury boiled over. You ungrateful snake, he shouted, grabbing Yila's wrist. She yanked free, her eyes wide with both fear and opportunity. For the first time, she saw clearly that Andrew was no longer her ticket to wealth and fame. He was her anchor, dragging her down into ruin. Don't touch me, she screamed, her voice carrying through the hall. She turned sharply toward the reporters, her words spilling out like venom. You want the truth? He told me everything. He bragged about moving money offshore, about how untouchable he was. He used me to sign the transfers so no one would trace it back directly to him. I was nothing but his cover. The hall exploded. Shouts, flashes, disbelief. Investors who had stood proudly at Andrew's side now recoiled, their faces pale with shock. The journalists pressed forward, shouting questions, their pens racing across notepads. Andrew lunged forward, his face twisted with rage. Liar, you liar. But it was too late. The damage was done. Yila had thrown him to the wolves to save herself. Emma watched, her hand steady on her belly, her heart pounding with vindication. This was justice, raw, brutal, undeniable. For the first time in months, she didn't feel small. She felt powerful, as though the universe itself had decided to return what Andrew had stolen from her. And yet, the scene wasn't over. Because just as Andrew tried to shout over the chaos, security guards entered the hall, their radios crackling. They moved quickly, their eyes fixed on him, and when one guard announced, Mr. Weston, authorities are waiting outside for questioning, the ballroom erupted in chaos, and Andrew's empire truly began to crumble. The night of Andrew's downfall lingered in Emma's mind like a storm finally breaking. She hadn't planned his humiliation, hadn't orchestrated Yila's betrayal, but she had stood tall through it all. And that changed something inside her. For the first time in months, she wasn't a victim. She wasn't a ghost in the room. She was a woman who had survived fire and emerged unburned. In the days that followed, the city buzzed with scandal. Headlines screamed of Andrew's corruption, of Yila's betrayal, of investors abandoning ship. Reporters sought Emma out, desperate for her story, but Ethan shielded her from the noise, giving her space to breathe. The storm is his, he told her. Yours is the dawn. And so, Emma began again. The first step was small but profound, standing in front of the mirror without shame. For weeks she had avoided her reflection, afraid of the hollow eyes staring back. But now when she looked, she saw traces of strength in her face, a quiet defiance etched into her features. Ethan's team arranged for what he called a reset. Not just a change of clothes, but a transformation of spirit. A stylist draped her in tailored gowns that embraced her pregnant figure, turning what society saw as weakness into a crown. Her hair, once neglected, was cut and styled into soft waves that framed her face with dignity. Makeup artists brushed away the fatigue, revealing the woman beneath, the one who had been hidden too long under Andrew's shadow. But the real transformation wasn't about fabric or color. It was about reclaiming her voice. Ethan introduced her to mentors, women who had faced their own humiliations, who had rebuilt themselves from nothing into leaders. Emma listened, learned, and slowly she began to speak of her own pain without fear. She discovered that her story wasn't one of shame, but of resilience. Late one evening, Emma sat with Ethan in his penthouse study, the city glowing like a galaxy outside the glass walls. She wore a simple, navy dress, her belly round, her eyes brighter than they had been in months. Why are you doing this for me? She asked quietly. Ethan leaned back, his gaze steady. Because I've seen men like Andrew all my life. They believe they can build empires by breaking others. But what they don't understand is that the people they step on often rise higher than they ever imagined. You don't see it yet, Emma, but you're going to be more than Andrew's ex-wife. You're going to be a woman he can never touch again. Emma's throat tightened. She didn't reply, but something in her heart shifted. For so long, she had believed her worth was tied to Andrew's name, his success, his approval. Now she understood. Her worth was hers alone. The following week, she stepped into the world again, not as the abandoned wife of a disgraced man, but as Emma Weston, reborn. She attended her first charity luncheon, not as a guest hiding in the corner, but as a speaker. Her voice trembled at first, but when she spoke about resilience, about rebuilding from ashes, the room fell silent. By the time she finished, the applause was thunderous, and Emma realized she had begun carving her own place in the world. But even as her star began to rise, Emma knew the battle wasn't over. Andrew wasn't finished, and Hila's betrayal had only scratched the surface of the empire of lies he had built. And when Emma received a call from a journalist, hinting at darker secrets still buried in Andrew's past, she knew her journey was far from complete. The real storm was yet to come. The city slept beneath a blanket of lights, but Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her modest bedroom. The night was quiet except for the steady hum of traffic far below, and yet her mind was anything but still. Every image from the past weeks haunted her. Andrew's smirk, Hila's betrayal, the cameras flashing like lightning as the world watched her humiliation. She pressed a hand against her belly, feeling the gentle curve that grew stronger each day. At first, the pregnancy had been a burden, a reminder of everything she had lost. But now, in the stillness of the night, she felt the life inside her differently. A soft flutter, a tiny kick. It wasn't just a child, it was a promise. Tears stung her eyes as she whispered into the darkness, "You're all I have, and I swear I'll never let anyone make you feel small. Not like I was made to feel." Her voice cracked, but she didn't hide the tremor. She wanted her baby, even unborn, to know the truth. Memories surfaced, nights of hunger when she'd skipped meals to save money, the crushing loneliness after Andrew left, the sting of strangers' pity. She had endured them all, not knowing if she had the strength to keep going. And yet here she was, alive, still standing, and stronger than she had ever been before. Her tears turned into something else, release. Emma allowed herself to cry freely, not out of despair, but out of love. She cradled her belly, rocking gently, as though already comforting her child. "You've saved me," she whispered. "Without you, I would have given up. But now I know I can't. Because you deserve a mother who never bows to cruelty. You deserve a future brighter than his shadow." The room seemed to listen, as though the universe itself was bearing witness to her vow. She remembered Ethan's words, "You're going to be more than Andrew's ex-wife." And in that moment, she believed it, not for herself, but for the tiny heartbeat inside her. She stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the glittering skyline. Each tower, each glowing office was a reminder of the world Andrew once ruled. A world that had spat her out. But she wasn't afraid anymore. The city wasn't his stage alone. She would carve her place in it, stone by stone, breath by breath. The baby kicked again, firmer this time, as if echoing her resolve. Emma smiled through her tears, pressing her palm against the movement. "That's right," she murmured. "We'll face this together, you and me." Her reflection in the glass startled her. No longer the hollow woman she once avoided, but someone fierce, alive, radiant with purpose. She had been broken, yes, but the pieces had rearranged into something unshakable. As dawn painted the horizon in soft pink, Emma whispered her vow aloud. "I will rise, and I will never let Andrew or anyone like him steal our light again." Her phone buzzed suddenly on the nightstand, breaking the silence. Heart racing, she picked it up. A message glowed across the screen, sharp and unsettling. "Andrew knows about the child. He's planning something. Be careful." Emma's breath caught, her hand instinctively shielding her belly, and in that fragile moment between fear and courage, she understood. Her fight wasn't just about reclaiming dignity anymore. It was about protecting her child from a storm that was far from over. Andrew Weston's fall from grace should have ended him. The scandal, the betrayal, the public humiliation, any ordinary man would have crumbled. But Andrew was no ordinary man. His arrogance wouldn't allow him to fade quietly into obscurity. Instead, it twisted into rage, into obsession. He spent his nights alone in a rented apartment that smelled of mold and cheap whiskey. The once proud name Weston, now a curse whispered across headlines. But even as investors abandoned him and Hila's betrayal replayed on every channel, Andrew clung to one thought. Emma. She had stood tall while he crumbled. She had dared to smile as the world watched him fall. And worst of all, she wasn't alone. Ethan Blackwell was at her side. Andrew paced his apartment, his reflection in the cracked mirror wild-eyed and gaunt. "She thinks she's won," he muttered, gripping a glass so tightly it shattered in his hand. Blood dripped across his palm, but he didn't flinch. "But I'll take everything from her. Everything." Meanwhile, Emma's world was shifting in the opposite direction. With Ethan's guidance, she had begun to rebuild, each day bringing new strength. Meetings with investors turned into opportunities. Charities she once admired invited her to speak. Her story, one of resilience, betrayal, and rebirth, captivated those who heard it. She was no longer just Andrew's discarded wife. She was Emma Weston, a woman rising from ashes. Still, Ethan was cautious. Andrew won't stay silent, he warned one evening, his voice low as they walked through his penthouse office. Men like him don't accept defeat, they strike back. Emma nodded, her hand resting protectively on her belly. Let him try. I won't run anymore. Ethan studied her, pride flickering in his eyes. Then we prepare. If he wants a war, we give him one, but on our terms. Their chance came sooner than expected. Invitations began circulating for an exclusive industry summit, a gathering of financial titans, philanthropists, and press. It was the kind of event Andrew once dominated, and rumor had it he intended to attend, desperate to reclaim his reputation. When Emma received her own invitation, she hesitated. The thought of facing Andrew again made her stomach twist. But Ethan placed the card back in her hands. This isn't just his stage anymore. It's yours. Show them who you've become. The days leading up to the summit were a blur of preparation. Emma worked tirelessly with Ethan's team, refining her speech, perfecting her presence, and strengthening her resolve. Each word she practiced carried the weight of her journey. Each glance in the mirror revealed a woman no longer hiding from her scars. On the eve of the event, she stood before Ethan, radiant in a gown of deep emerald silk that shimmered with every breath. Do you think I'm ready? She asked softly. Ethan's gaze was unwavering. You're more than ready. You're inevitable. Yet across the city, Andrew sharpened his own weapons. He had gathered files, twisted half-truths, and damaging rumors. His plan was simple. Destroy Emma publicly before she could rise further. If he couldn't rebuild his empire, he would at least drag her down into the rubble with him. The night of the summit arrived. Flashing lights bathed the Grand Hotel entrance. Cameras hungry for the stories that would unfold inside. Emma stepped from her car, her heart steady, her spirit unshaken. But as she walked into the glittering hall, surrounded by power and wealth, she caught sight of Andrew in the distance, his eyes locked on hers, burning with fury. And in that instant, Emma knew this night would not end with words alone. It would end with war. The ballroom at the summit was a cathedral of glass and light, filled with the sharpest minds and deepest pockets in the financial world. Reporters lined the walls, their pens poised, while investors mingled, sipping champagne worth more than most salaries. On stage, speakers droned about innovation and growth, but the real tension simmered beneath the surface. Everyone knew Andrew Weston would make his move. Emma sat near the front, her emerald gown glowing beneath the chandeliers, Ethan steady at her side. Her nerves hummed like electricity, but she forced herself to breathe. She wasn't here as Andrew's victim anymore. She was here as herself. The moment came when Andrew took the stage. He looked worn, his suit slightly ill-fitted, his smile too tight, but his voice, sharp and practiced, still carried the arrogance of a man unwilling to bow. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, we live in an age of betrayal. Once I was the target of malicious lies, my company, my name dragged through the mud, and at the center of it all was one woman, my ex-wife, Emma Weston. Gasps rippled. Cameras swung instantly toward Emma, who sat frozen, her chin held high. Andrew leaned into the microphone, venom dripping from every word. She plays the victim, he sneered. But the truth? She's nothing but a manipulator. She conspired with Ethan Blackwell to destroy me, to steal my investors, to ruin what I built with my bare hands. And now she hides behind her pregnancy pretending to be innocent, when in reality, enough. The single word cut through the ballroom like a blade. All eyes turned to Ethan, who rose slowly, his presence commanding silence. He walked toward the stage, his voice calm but cold. You accuse her of lies, Andrew, but what you call betrayal is nothing more than the truth finally catching up to you. Andrew laughed bitterly. Truth? You think you can walk in here with your billions and rewrite history? These people know me. He gestured wildly to the crowd. They know what I've built. Ethan's eyes didn't waver. Do they know about the offshore accounts? The stolen charity funds? The shell companies in Hila's name? Because I have proof. And tonight, so does everyone else. At his signal, screens around the ballroom lit up. Documents appeared. Bank statements, email trails, signed transfers. Gasps filled the room as the evidence scrolled across the glowing displays, undeniable and damning. Andrew's face drained of color. He stumbled forward, desperate. This is doctored. Lies. Emma planted this. But Emma rose then, her voice clear, strong, carrying across the hall. No, Andrew, you planted your own downfall. Every cruel word, every stolen dollar, every life you trampled, it all led here. You wanted me broken. Instead, you've shown the world who you truly are. The room erupted in applause, not polite, but thunderous, cathartic. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. Investors whispered furiously, many already pulling out phones to sever ties. Andrew, once untouchable, stood cornered under the harsh light of truth. Ela, seated near the back, slipped out quietly, her face pale. Even she knew the empire had collapsed. Security moved toward the stage. Andrew tried to bolt, but the crowd swallowed him. His shouts of lies, conspiracy, rang hollow against the roar of voices demanding accountability. Emma remained standing, her hand resting protectively on her belly, her head high. For the first time she felt not fear, but freedom. And as Andrew was dragged from the stage, his cries drowned by flashing cameras, Emma knew this wasn't just his end, it was the beginning of her legacy. Andrew Weston had once ruled rooms like a king. His name carried weight, his smile opened doors, and his arrogance seemed untouchable. But in the days after the summit, his kingdom crumbled faster than anyone could have imagined. The headlines were merciless. Weston exposed, millions stolen from charities. Andrew Weston faces criminal charges. Mistress turns on fallen mogul. Every newspaper, every network, every gossip site carried his disgrace. Photos of him being escorted out of the ballroom in handcuffs plastered the front pages, a cruel mirror of the days when his face had graced magazine covers celebrating his success. Investors pulled out overnight, draining Weston capital of its lifeblood. Clients canceled contracts, stock prices plummeted, and within a week, the empire Andrew had built stood in ruins. Offices once bustling with staff fell silent. The company name was stripped from buildings. The logo erased from the financial world, like chalk washed away by rain. But the worst blow wasn't financial, it was personal. Ela, who had once clung to his arm like a jewel, vanished. She sold her story to the tabloids, painting herself as the manipulated mistress, the naive girl used as a pawn. In interviews she wept, insisting she had no idea of Andrew's crimes. The public devoured her tears, and while some doubted her innocence, the damage was clear. She had abandoned him to save herself. Alone in a dingy motel on the edge of the city, Andrew stared at the flickering television replaying his downfall. His suit, once tailored to perfection, hung wrinkled on his frame. His eyes, once sharp with ambition, now looked hollow. Bottles littered the table beside him, the bitter stench of whiskey filling the room. How, he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse. How did it all slip away? The answer was everywhere. The arrogance that once fueled him had become his noose. The people he mocked, the trust he betrayed, the woman he discarded, they had all formed the cracks that shattered his foundation. Meanwhile, Emma's name appeared in headlines too, but hers carried hope. Emma Weston speaks on resilience. Ex-wife of fallen mogul inspires women worldwide. The world that once pitied her now applauded her courage. For every jeer Andrew endured, Emma received applause. Their fates had flipped, as though the universe itself had rewritten the story. Andrew watched her interviews through bloodshot eyes. He sneered at her calm strength, her radiant smile, the way she carried herself with dignity. He threw the remote at the screen, shattering the glass. "She's nothing without me," he shouted, though the words rang hollow even to him. Days blurred into nights, and soon the authorities closed in. Court dates loomed, investigations piled higher, and rumors of prison echoed through every channel. Andrew, once the untouchable mogul, now faced the reality of orange jumpsuits and locked bars. On the morning of his arraignment, photographers swarmed as police led him into the courthouse. He tried to hold his head high, but the jeers from the crowd pierced his pride. Thief, liar, scum. The man who once commanded respect now received only contempt. Inside the courtroom, Emma didn't attend. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than any confrontation. Andrew searched the crowd anyway, desperate for a glimpse of her, as though her presence could tether him to the power he had lost. But she was gone, out of his reach forever. As the judge read the charges, Andrew slumped in his chair. His empire was gone. His mistress had betrayed him. His name was poison. And the woman he once tried to destroy now stood higher than he had ever reached. And as the gavel struck, sealing his fate, Andrew realized the cruelest truth of all. Emma's story had only just begun, while his had ended in ashes. The storm had passed. For months, Emma's life had been a battlefield of humiliation, betrayal, and public spectacle. But now, as the dust settled, she found herself standing in a place she had never known before, peace. Her small apartment, once filled with silence heavy as grief, now felt like a sanctuary. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, warming the walls, the faint scent of lavender drifting from a candle flickering on the windowsill. Emma sat by the crib she had assembled herself, running her fingers along the smooth wood. The room wasn't lavish, but it was filled with love, and that, she realized, mattered more than any penthouse or marble ballroom. Her belly had grown full and round. Each movement of her child inside reminded her of the future she was building, not out of Andrew's ashes but from her own strength. At night, when the world was quiet, she read stories aloud, her voice soft and steady, imagining the day her baby would listen with wide eyes. But healing wasn't just about preparing for the future. It was about making peace with the past. Emma spent long hours journaling, pouring onto the page every wound Andrew had left, every cruel word, every tear. Then, one evening, she carried the notebook to the balcony, lit a match, and watched the pages burn. The flames devoured her pain, the smoke drifting into the night sky like a release. For the first time, she felt free. Ethan was often near, though never imposing. He gave her space to grow, yet stood steady whenever she faltered. Some nights they sat together on the balcony, watching the city lights glitter like 1,000 promises. "You've changed," he said one evening, his tone both gentle and proud. Emma smiled faintly. "I had to. For me, for the baby." "You're stronger than most people I've ever met," Ethan replied. "Not because you never broke, but because you rebuilt yourself." His words sank deep, filling the cracks inside her with something new, hope. As her due date approached, Emma prepared meticulously. She folded tiny clothes, stocked shelves with diapers and bottles, and decorated the walls with pastel stars. Each detail was a declaration of love, a reminder that her child would enter a world where resilience, not cruelty, defined their story. But healing wasn't just physical or emotional. It was spiritual. One afternoon, Emma visited her mother's grave, a place she had avoided for too long. Kneeling by the stone, she placed fresh lilies and whispered, "I'm going to be the kind of mother you were. Strong, loving, fierce. I'll protect my child the way you tried to protect me." Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they were no longer tears of despair. They were tears of release. The city, once a hostile arena, now felt different. Walking through the streets, Emma no longer lowered her gaze. Strangers recognized her, sometimes stopping to thank her for speaking publicly about resilience. She hadn't set out to inspire anyone, but her journey had become more than personal. It had become a beacon. Still, shadows lingered. Andrew's trial loomed, and though his empire had crumbled, his bitterness had not. Emma knew he wasn't finished trying to strike at her, even from the depths of disgrace. One evening, as she rocked gently in the chair beside the crib, her phone buzzed. A message appeared from an unknown number. "He blames you for everything, and he's not done. Protect yourself, and the child." Emma's heart raced, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. The healing she had fought so hard for was real, but so was the danger that lingered. And in that moment, Emma realized her greatest test was yet to come. The battle to protect her child from the last desperate grasp of a man consumed by ruin. The night air was heavy with rain, the city streets slick and glistening under the glow of street lamps. Emma sat in her apartment, rocking slowly in the chair by the crib, humming softly to her unborn child. She had spent weeks building peace, healing her wounds, preparing for the new life she would soon hold in her arms. But peace, she learned, never came without a test. Andrew Weston was drowning. The trial dates loomed, evidence stacked high against him, and his name had become a punchline whispered in boardrooms. Yet, even stripped of his empire, he clung to one obsession. Emma. In his twisted mind, she was the reason for his downfall, the woman who had turned his empire into rubble. And he would not let her rest. That night, while the storm rolled over the city, Andrew made his move. He appeared at Emma's building, his figure drenched, eyes bloodshot, his once polished suit hanging like rags. He slipped past the doorman with a forceful shove and climbed the stairs 2 at a time, his rage fueling every step. Inside, Emma froze at the sound of pounding on her door. Her heart leapt to her throat. She knew instantly who it was. Her phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. Security lost track of Andrew. "Stay calm. I'm coming." But the pounding grew louder. "Emma." Andrew's voice was hoarse, edged with madness. "Open this door. You think you can ruin me and hide behind Blackwell's money? You're nothing without me." Emma's hands trembled, but she stood, placing herself between the door and the crib. Her fear was real, but so was her resolve. "Leave, Andrew," she said firmly, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "You don't belong here anymore." The lock rattled. Andrew slammed harder, his fury echoing down the hallway. "You ruined me. You stole everything. You and that bastard Blackwell." Before he could finish, the door burst open. Security, flanked by Ethan, stormed the hall. Andrew stumbled back, wild-eyed, his plan unraveling before it could begin. "Andrew," Ethan's voice cut like steel, "this ends tonight." But Andrew wasn't finished. He lunged forward, pointing at Emma, his words dripping venom. "You'll regret this. I'll drag you down with me, if it's the last thing I do." Emma stepped forward, her hand resting on her belly, her voice calm yet unbreakable. No, Andrew. The only thing you've destroyed is yourself. You tried to break me, but all you did was make me stronger. My child will never know your cruelty. That's your true punishment. You'll be forgotten. The words struck harder than any blow. For a moment, Andrew's fury faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear. He looked at her, the woman he once dismissed, the woman he thought he owned, and saw not weakness, but strength he could never match. Security restrained him, dragging him toward the waiting police outside. His shouts echoed through the hall, but they no longer carried power. They were the cries of a man who had lost everything. Emma stood in the doorway, breath trembling, Ethan at her side. She felt the baby move inside her, a reminder of the future she had vowed to protect. For the first time, she didn't feel like prey. She felt victorious. As Andrew disappeared into the storm, swallowed by flashing red and blue lights, Emma exhaled deeply, tears sliding down her cheeks, not of fear, but of release. And as Ethan wrapped his arm around her shoulders, Emma knew the final chapter was coming, the birth of her child. The ultimate proof that from ruin, life could bloom anew. The storm that carried Andrew out of her life left behind a quiet Emma had never known. For weeks she lived in the rhythm of anticipation, each day slower than the last, each night restless with both fear and hope. She knew the world was watching her, but in her heart, the only gaze she cared about was the one that would soon meet hers, her child's. The morning it happened was calm. Dawn painted the sky in shades of gold as Emma felt the first sharp pain. At first, she clutched her belly, fear whispering through her veins. But then came another kick, stronger than before, and she understood. It was time. Ethan rushed her to the hospital, his presence steady, his hand never leaving hers. The hours that followed were long and grueling, her body trembling, her breath ragged, but Emma fought with everything she had. Each contraction was a battle, each push a promise, and finally as the sun dipped low, a cry split the room. Her baby. Tears streamed down Emma's cheeks as the nurse placed the tiny bundle against her chest. The world seemed to fall away, the whispers, the humiliation, the pain of betrayal. All that remained was this fragile life, eyes blinking open, lips curling around their first breath. Emma cradled the child gently, whispering, "You're safe now, you're mine, and nothing will ever break us." Ethan stood nearby, his gaze softening in a way Emma had never seen before. "You did it," he murmured. Emma looked up, exhaustion painted across her face, but her smile radiant. "No, we did it. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." For days after, Emma stayed in the hospital, recovering. The headlines continued, but this time they spoke of rebirth. Emma Weston welcomes new life amid past scandal. From broken wife to empowered mother, a story of hope. The world had tried to define her by Andrew's shadow, but now she was writing her own story. When she finally brought her baby home, she stood at the doorway of the nursery she had built with trembling hands. She placed the child in the crib, the room filled with soft stars and lullabies. The silence was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. Emma whispered a vow aloud, her voice steady and full of power. "You will grow up never knowing fear, never doubting your worth. Because I will show you that strength isn't about never falling, it's about rising, every time you do." She knew Andrew's name would fade, his trial, his downfall, his bitterness, it would all dissolve into history. But her child would grow surrounded by love, by resilience, by the truth that even the deepest wounds could heal. That evening she stood by the window, holding her baby close, the city skyline glowing in the distance. Ethan joined her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. Together they watched the lights flicker, two souls no longer haunted by the past but looking forward to the future. Emma pressed a kiss to her child's forehead, tears glistening in her eyes. The pain had not been erased, but it had been transformed, turned into strength, into love, into hope. And with the city stretching before her, Emma whispered the words that defined her journey. "Women are never weak. We bend, we break, but we rise stronger than ever. And this time, we rise for those we love." So, that's how the story closes, my wonderful friends. You're still here with me, right? If you've stayed until this moment, it means something in Emma's journey has touched your heart in a way that words alone can't explain. And maybe that's because her story isn't just about betrayal or revenge, it's about healing, resilience, and discovering strength we didn't know we had. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That's exactly what Emma learned. She couldn't control Andrew's cruelty, but she could control her response. She chose to rise not for revenge alone, but for love, for her child, and for herself. And isn't that something we all need to remember? Life will throw storms, heartbreaks, even humiliations, but none of those define us. What defines us is the choice to stand again, to rebuild, to live with dignity. If this story stirred something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who might need hope tonight, and subscribe so we can walk through more stories of strength together. Because like Emma, we all have the power to rise.